Good afternoon and welcome to the Samuel Center for Canal History and this presentation being hosted by the Old Men's Heritage Center. We thank the Canal Society in New York State for allowing us to use this space. It's a great space if you have not been here before. It's the archives for the Canal Society of New York State, world-class Smithsonian quality archives, and I always like to say it's a genealogical program, kind of. There's a lot of family history in those archives there. So look for opportunities to come here and study if you're looking into that or doing canal research. And this is Craig Williams, the past president of the Canal Society, who is acting as our host. My name is Mike Bradley. I am the president of the Old Men's Heritage Center, who, if you're not familiar with that term, it's now used to be Lock 52 and the Montezuma Historic Societies. We merged and became one, and now we're on the corner of where the shopping guide is, if you're looking for us. So we're happy to be here and be hosting this. Some housekeeping to get out of the way. Exits are where you came in the door, and there's also a handicapped exit over here that we have opened up, and you go straight out this hall. Bathrooms are over here to my right. There's 2 bathrooms. They're unisex, so feel free to use either one. They're very nice bathrooms. Brand new, very nice bathrooms. And we encourage you to use them because it's a lot of money fixing them up. This is being recorded. You see a couple cameras out there, so please don't feel you have to have your camera up. Enjoy the presentation. You can always refer back, but be in the moment and make sure your cell phones are off so you're not interrupting. Let's see, the Old Men's Heritage Center, along with the Port Byron Library, we host a monthly gathering called Genealogical Gatherings, and we are pleased to be able to host this as part of that, and also as part of the next year is 250th anniversary or commemoration, celebration, however you want to phrase it, of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 1776. So it's next year you're going to be seeing a lot of activities related to that time period of Revolutionary War. So this is kind of a kickoff for us into doing that. Our speaker, Bernie, I never say your name right. Corcoran. I always want to add an extra C to it. Corcoran has decades of research and study into this topic. He was at the come on up, Bernie. He was were you manager at Real Property? I should have figured this out before I introduced you, but you worked at the Real Property office in Cuyahoga County, and so has extensive research and experience with these records, and is our go-to guy if we have questions about the Military Tract. He is also co-host of the Cuyahoga County Gen Web. Are you the founder too?
Yes.
Founder of the Cuyahoga County.
Actually, no, somebody had it for about a month before
It is by far the best genealogical website run at the county level that I've seen in the country. And if you don't believe me, just go to the Cuyahoga County Gen website. So, and he has an extensive collection of paper goods up here, and he says after this presentation, you're more than welcome to come up and ask more questions and see that. And I'll also point out in the back, we do have copies of our book that we put out this year, Following the Flow. It makes excellent Christmas gifts, $20 each. It's a guided tour to the Erie Canal between Camillus and Montezuma. Lots of pretty pictures, and so just wanted to put that up there for you. Bernie?
I don't know if you need the microphone to hear me or not, but I'll try to speak close enough to it. And as Mike said, this is being videotaped, so I guess if you missed something, it'll be available on their YouTube channel, I guess. My talk today is going to be on the Military Tract of Central New York. And there's about 40 or more slides in the presentation, and I'm hoping I can get through it in about an hour or so. And if I get to be an hour longer, grab the hook and just tell me that I've overstayed my welcome. This is a rough map of the Military Tract that just shows the outlines of the different military tract townships, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about how the townships came to be formed, how they were surveyed, how it came to be that the townships were later broken down into towns, and so forth. I'm going to show some examples of some of the records from the time period. So to get started, I just want to ask you a question. Where are you now? This is a 1996, 1976 rather, tax roll for the town of Mentz. And there's a column there that says lot. And as Mike said, I worked for the Real Property Assessment Office for 3 decades. And before that, I worked for the engineering company that was hired to draw the Cuyahoga County's first set of tax maps. And part of that task was to go to the county clerk's office, search everybody's deed at the time, and they wanted the military tract boundary lines shown on the tax maps. And nobody had done that. Except for commercial maps that were drawn in the 1800s, nobody had taken the military tract boundary lines and tried to plot them on current maps. So this is a 1976 tax roll. There's a column for reference location that lists the lot numbers. So I asked you, this is the description of what the military tract is. The military tract was an area of 1.8 million acres located in the heartland of central New York. Men that had enlisted in certain Revolutionary War infantry regiments from New York, there were actually 2 regiments, were awarded bounty land or gratuity land for their service. And the deeds for properties in Cuyahoga County still refer to these military tract lot numbers. Now I asked you if you knew where you were right now. Can you tell that this used to be a church? If you look at the grantee index for 1898, it says that there are 2 deeds that cover this property. It was purchased in 2 separate deeds. And if you look at the listing from the grantee index, it says that this particular property is in township number 4, and it's lot 73. And these are portions of those 2 deeds. And again, it says lot 73 Brutus, and it says that that is now the town of Mentz. And the other deed says that it's part of Great Lot 73. Military tract lots actually were referred to as Great Lots. Going in the right direction here. Okay, that was a deed that was 127 years ago. What about today? Do we know anybody in the neighborhood that bought property in the last year? Well, it turns out that the old Mentz Heritage Center, the deed was recorded and was dated April of 2025, and that deed today still refers to this area being part of lot 73. To start and figure out where lot 73 and Brutus came from, we have to start with the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Who resided here in 1768? It was the Native Americans. And previously in 1763, Great Britain had issued a proclamation describing the division line. They called it the line of property. It separated the land that was occupied by the Haudenosaunee nations from the area that was occupied by the settlers of the colonies. And because the description in the proclamation was so vague, they needed to actually get together and sign a treaty. And this is a map from the Fort Stanwix, is now a national park. This is a map from their website showing the boundary that divided the land of the Haudenosaunee from the land of the settlers in the colonies of New York. So I couldn't find a good map that showed the military tract boundaries and the different nations. So I drew one. This is very much approximate, but it shows the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, and it shows the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Tuscarora, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And I tried to show the, let me go back. Press the wrong button. I tried to show, this isn't very accurate, but I tried to show the boundaries of the military tract. And you can see that the military tract was sandwiched between the land of the Oneida and the Tuscarora nations and the preemption line. That was not just a coincidence, that was intentional. When the Revolutionary War broke out, the first shots in the Revolutionary War was in April of 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Stamford. And they asked, all of the 6 nations had to make a decision. Were they going to be allies and support the American colonies in the Revolution, or were they going to support and be allies of Great Britain? 2 of the 6 nations opted to be allies of the American colonies, Tuscarora and Oneida. The Mohawks, the Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca nations all were allies of Great Britain. So I'll get into this later on, but when they decided to define where the military tract would be located, because the Oneida and the Tuscarora nations were allies and friends of the American colonies, they intentionally did not want to interfere with their land. So the military tract was located just west of their boundary. And the preemption line, that's a subject you could talk about for an hour by itself, but the land west of that line, based on treaties and proclamations in the 1600s, was claimed to be owned by Massachusetts. However, New York didn't agree with that. And in 1786, there was a treaty, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but there was a treaty at Hartford, and it was decided that the western portion west of that preemption line, where the Seneca Nation land is, and west of that would be considered New York. However, Massachusetts wanted to maintain the option to negotiate with the Seneca when it came time for them to release ownership of their land. So any treaties with the Seneca Nation would have to be approved by Massachusetts. So this, this area here was at one time considered part of Massachusetts. And the preemption line, when it was established as the preemption line, Massachusetts had preemptive rights to control what happened when it came time for the Seneca Nation to release their ownership of that. So how long would the Revolutionary War go on? It started with the first shots in 1775, and in 1776, the Congress signed the Declaration of Independence. And as Mike said, next year is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And they're referring to that as America 250. And I'd like to say that we intentionally scheduled this for that particular reason, but it just turned out that way. There's a documentary that's going to start airing on the 16th on public television with Ken Burns, called The American Revolution, and that's why this is sort of timely for that particular reason. They needed.
Move your mic.
I'm sorry. They needed money and men to fight the war, and there was no money to be had. New York didn't have money to pay the soldiers to enlist. Continental Congress didn't have money to pay the soldiers to enlist. And they needed some way to induce the soldiers to enlist in the armies. This is the 13 colonies. So in order to persuade they decided that in order to win the war, they would need 88 battalions of soldiers. And the battalions would be broken down in numbers based on the populations of the 13 colonies. This is a breakdown of the quota of battalions. And just to clarify, in the laws for the Congress, they refer to battalions. In the laws for New York, they refer to regiments. In terms of the Revolutionary War, they're the same thing. A regiment, even though a regiment is customarily larger, in the Revolutionary War, a regiment was a battalion. And if you Google how many people were in a regiment and battalion in the Revolutionary War, they claim it's 728. But there were so many people that joined the regiment. People died, people would occasionally desert, they would have issues at home and they would come back home. So even though there may be a threshold number for people in the battalions, it varied a lot. I think at certain times there may have been 1,000 people in a regiment, and other times there may have been much less because they were still trying to muster people. New York had a quota of 4 battalions based on their population. But they still didn't have a way to get the soldiers to enlist. They couldn't offer them money. They tried offering them bounties of wheat. That didn't work. Congress decided to grant bounty land on September 16, 1776, based on they gave them $20 in bounty land based on their rank when they were in the regiments. The bounty land, now you have to distinguish that this is not the military tract. This is Congress's offer for bounty land. This bounty land was described in the laws as being in the Northwest Territory. It was unappropriated land, and it turned out that the Northwest Territory, the area that they would give this bounty land from Congress, was in Ohio. They would give each soldier that enlisted a certificate of enlistment that could be used as a bounty land voucher. So the war is going on. It started in 1775. They were trying to raise the regiments. And in 1779, the Haudenosaunee Nation that were supporting Great Britain were participating in raids on the colonial settlers. And there were raids that were done in 1778, and it was resulting in the settlers not wanting to join the militia because they were afraid that there were going to be raids in the area. And so, and part of the raids were being supported by the Native Americans that supported Great Britain. So General Sullivan ordered a campaign that would be headed by General Sullivan to go from Eaton, Pennsylvania up into the Finger Lakes and destroy all of the Native American encampments along the way. And this is a map from the Library of Congress showing the route of the Sullivan campaign. Now, if you know about the history of Auburn, John Hardenberg, that settled Hardenberg's Corners that became Auburn, New York. He was a soldier on this campaign, and in Hardenberg's journals, he refers to using a chain and a compass to survey the route of the Sullivan campaign. So he contributed the survey work that resulted in this map. And John Hardenberg had a brother, Abraham Hardenberg, that would later become one of the chief surveyors surveying the military tract. Now, and the campaign resulted in totally devastating 40 Native American villages along the route. They came up from Pennsylvania, they came up the east side of Cuba Lake, and I don't know whether you can see on it, but there's little like rectangular squares. Those were villages that were destroyed by the Continental Army. There were 4,400, more or less, Continental soldiers that came up through the area, and they destroyed the homes, the crops, the orchards, the food supplies, and it totally devastated the Native Americans in this area so that they would no longer be able to be a threat and carry on any more raids on the colonials. Now, by 1781, there were still only 2 of the 4 regiments or battalions formed, and there was little faith in the currency of New York State. There was not only a shortage of currency, but they would issue currency of a certain value, and within a year, the value would drop down to about 40 cents on the dollar of what it was. So there wasn't a lot of faith in the currency at the time either. So they still needed to meet their quota of 4 battalions, and they wanted some way to induce the soldiers to enlist. So they decided to up the ante. There was 100 acres that was offered by Congress. They decided to add 500 more acres to that, so there was a total of 600 acres in total that would be offered as bounty land if they would enlist. And it would be even higher if you were a lieutenant, captain, major, colonel, brigadier, major general, and so forth. And that law was in March 20th, 1781. And they revised the law in 1783 because they forgot to mention brigadier generals and major generals in the earlier law. Now they specifically in this law, and I brought a copy of the law if anybody wants to read through it. It's kind of difficult to decipher, but they specifically say in the law that defined they were going to give 500 more acres. They specifically defined that it will not include land belonging, and they use the word belonging, to Oneida and Tuscarora nations. So that's why the Military Tract is sandwiched between the boundary of the western boundary of the Oneida Tuscarora nation and the preemption line. So how long did the Revolutionary War last? General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. So it lasted from 1775 to 1781. And when the soldiers enlisted in those 2 regiments that resulted in them getting bounty land in what would become the Military Tract, they had to enlist for 3 years. And as it turns out, that's about how long it took before the end of the Revolutionary War, because it wasn't considered ended until the signing of the Treaty of Paris in September 3rd, 1783. And in between that time, you would think that there was no more battle going on because Cornwallis had surrendered. It's not true. There was still fighting going on in the Revolutionary War. It was not as intense as it used to be, but they didn't totally consider peace until after that treaty was signed. So what were the boundaries of the Military Tract? Surprisingly, Cornwallis surrendered in 1781, but they didn't sign the treaty until 1783. So in between, New York State had already decided where they wanted that Military Tract land to be. And that was partly because the soldiers that came through the area during the Sullivan campaign, they saw how beautiful central New York was. They saw how fertile it was. They saw how the amazing bodies of water, the Finger Lakes, they saw the Seneca River, all the amazing attributes of central New York, and they fell in love with it. So after the Sullivan campaign, they came back and they strongly advocated to people that had any authority that this would be the place that they would want the military tract to be located. So they set aside the central New York, an area that was to be known as the military tract. And this is the way they described it in that 1782 law. The tract would include all the land situated in line between the county of Tryon, which was pretty much, that county included all of central New York at the time, and then some. It was bounded north by Lake Ontario and the Onondaga River, which is actually today the Oswego River, Oneida Lake on the west, and a line drawn from the mouth of Great Sordus or Sordus Creek through the most westerly inclination of the Seneca Lake on the south and east. So this is the way it was described in the law. But in the law, it specifically said that it would be drawn from the most westerly boundary of the Oneida and Tuscarora country. So again, because they were allies of the American colonies, they were not going to interfere with the Oneida and Tuscarora land. They were going to leave them alone and locate the military tract west of that. Now, when the 1783 Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War, the soldiers who were eligible for the bounty land demanded their land. They had been promised this land if they would serve in the Revolutionary War. And I'm sure at the time, people wondered whether, because there was such devastation in the Cuban nation land, whether they would be quickly agreeable to sign off on their land, or whether they would want to have a treaty and negotiate. And there were a lot of issues going on, and it was probably a difficult negotiation. Can you imagine that if somebody came along and destroyed your home, destroyed your crops, and then they said, forget all about that, we want to talk to you about giving up your rights to your land so that we can give it to as bounty land to Revolutionary War soldiers. So it probably was a very difficult negotiation, and that's why it took 6 years before they would negotiate a treaty for the Cayuga and Onondaga nations to give up their rights to the land that became the military tract so that they could offer it as bounty land to the Revolutionary War soldiers. Now, in 1784, right after the conclusion of or a year after the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, the state legislature passes a law to appoint commissioners to assume the responsibility of granting the bounty land. And on May 3rd, 2 days later, Simeon DeWitt, who there's a map I brought that's on the taller map on the far right there, is a map that was drawn by Simeon DeWitt of the military tract. He was the Surveyor General of New York State. He had previously been the Surveyor General for the Continental Army. And that map that I showed you from the Library of Congress doesn't have his name on it, but he was no doubt involved in drafting that map. So Simeon DeWitt, his name is going to come up again in the presentation. He was the Surveyor General of New York State at the time. And he would be in charge of surveying the military tract townships. And each township, in order to have 600 acres, had to be 60,000 acres because there was 100 lots in each township. And except when the lots were bordering a body of water, the law said that they should be as near as possible to being square. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. They weren't necessarily square. This isn't a very accurate map, but I wanted to show you that sometimes they refer to the military tract as the new military tract. And that's because they're actually, even though the shape may not be real accurate on this map, there was a old military tract. By 1786, it was 3 years after the end of the Revolutionary War, and the soldiers were demanding their land, and the state had promised them land, so they decided to take a tract of land that did not involve negotiating any treaties with Native Americans, but it was way up north of the Adirondacks. It was in Franklin County and Clinton County, and it was way up here. And when they offered it, even though they said it as they mapped it, I couldn't find a map of the specific boundaries on the internet. But even though they had mapped it and they offered it as an option of exchanging the land in the tentative proposed pending new military tract, they offered them land in this old military tract area. Not one of the soldiers that was eligible for the land in the new military tract opted to exchange for land in the old military tract. So they needed to negotiate with the with the Onondaga and Cayuga nations. And this is the Onondaga Reservation, and this is the Cayuga Reservation. And I've got to refer to my notes a little bit here. So. Okay. On 1788, the Onondaga tribe accepted the Onondaga Reservation of 100 square miles. And when they did that, this is the Onondaga Reservation, when they did that, they gave up their claim to all the rest of the military tract. A year later, the Cayuga tribe would give up their claim to all of the military tract, and they would also get about 100 square miles of land that would straddle both sides of the north portion of Cayuga Lake. Now, what's always amazed me is in the survey notes for the military tract and the subsequent survey of the Cayuga Reservation. Let me go back. This point right here, this point right there, is the midpoint, is described as the midpoint between the mouth of Cayuga Lake and Owasco Lake. How did they survey and know where that midpoint was in 1789 or 1790? It absolutely amazes me that it was a total wilderness here at the time, how they would have been able to survey that and define that as the midpoint between the mouth of the two lakes. They would later, about 5 years later, the Cayuga and Onondaga Nation would give up claim to most of the land in their reservations, and they would move to an even smaller reservation area. This is a map. It's actually 5 years later, but it shows the boundaries of the Onondaga Reservation. And there was an area that was just along what they called Salt Lake, Onondaga Lake. And it shows on the map that Simeon DeWitt drew as a public reservation. That's because the Native Americans, the Onondaga, wanted to be able to access the salt, and so did the settlers in the colony. So they called it a public reservation, and either one could get to Salt Lake on that area and utilize the salt from Salt Lake. And this is a similar map of the Cayuga Reservation. And 5 years later, when they divided the Cayuga Reservation into lots, they would be smaller lots. They would be 250-acre lots. And the same thing was true in the Onondaga Reservation. And this was surveyed by Joseph Annan. That's that name is Annan, 1795. There were actually a team of 20 surveyors that were in the Surveyor General's office. And each one of the townships would be surveyed by a smaller team. In fact, some of them if you look at the field notes for the surveys, they usually only list a supervising surveyor and 2 assistants. The supervisor would usually be the person with the compass that was actually sighting the direction of the course when they surveyed the boundaries of the military tract. And the other 2 would be the people that measured the distances.
How many people were involved with this?
Well, there were 20 actual land surveyors that were on the team for the military tract. I don't know as a total how many other people were involved. There was a land commission that was formed in 1784, and Simeon DeWitt would have been a part of that. The secretary of the land commission was Robert Harper, and he would be credited as being the person that names the military tracts and gives them the Roman, Latin, or classical names, I don't know what Roman Greek names that were given to the military tract. So how did they survey the military tract lots? There were actually 2 main tools that they used. They used a compass and they used a surveyor's chain. And the compass, I found some of the original field notes, and what I had always presumed to be true when I worked at the county drafting these lines out of the tax maps was actually defined on a few of the survey notes, that they surveyed by using due magnetic north and due magnetic east and west. They did not adjust for the variation between magnetic north and true north, which today is almost 13 degrees variation. I tried to, if you can believe AI on Google, they're claiming that, and it does vary from year to year, they're claiming that in the 1790s, the variation between true north and magnetic north may have been 6 to 10 degrees. And that may have contributed to the fact that the preemption line had to be surveyed twice, because the first survey was quite a bit off. It was 2 degrees at Lake Ontario, which amounted to almost at that particular point, almost a 2-mile variation of where that line should be. So they used a Gunther's chain, which had a total of 100 links. The links are actually like wire links, and each link was 7.92 inches long, so the total chain was 66 feet long. And as they measured the boundaries of the military tract lots, they would keep overlapping this chain, and they would count how many chain links and how many links. So it was defined in the surveyor notes as lengths, how many lengths of chain and how many links. The preliminary surveys for the first 25 military tract lots were approved by the State Land Office on July 3rd, 1790, and the townships were named. This is an example of the field note page for right where we are right now. This is lot 73. If we remember back to the deed for this property and for the old Men's Heritage Center, it said that you were part of lot 73 here. And this is the actual survey notes for lot 73. I transcribed this to make it a little bit easier. This is what it says. The southbounds are at the southeast corner of the state, marked by a birch tree. This 12 links north from the tree that's marked for this. On the northwest side, it's going to say number 73. On the northeast side, it's going to say 74, and so forth. Can you imagine being the soldier that was balloted for this land, and they tell you, travel up to Owasco Lake, go up the outlet about 7 or 8 miles, and look for a tree that's got 73 carved in the side of it. When they define the boundary lines of the military tract in the surveyor notes, sometimes when they survey a specific line, they mention in the survey notes what they found at different intervals along that line. So in this case, when they're surveying the west line, at 15 chains they crossed a small brook. At 30 chains there was ascending gradually. they were at the top of a hill on 40 chains. At 45 chains, they were at the foot of the hill. At 53 chains, they were at the Owasco outlet. And the outlet was 2 chains wide, apparently, which would have been 132 feet there. Because at 55 chains, they were across the outlet and bearing northerly. So this is the way the boundaries of the military tract in the surveyor notes are referred. And in the surveyor notes, at the end of each page, for each lot, they would define that the lot, the land was good or poor, and they would say sometimes what type of trees were on the land. So in 1790, this land was considered by the surveyors to be good land, and the timber was birch and maple. Now, this land was considered good in this area. East of here, over towards Centerport Road, do you think that was good or poor? It was neither. They called it land tolerable. It says land tolerable timber. We're not sure if that says beech or birch, maple and linden trees. So this was the surveyor notes for the lot east of here. I managed to get a couple examples for this presentation. I tried to get all of the surveyor notes for the township of Prudence, and as it turns out, the state archives will send you 1 or 2 things without a problem. But if you want 100 pages, that becomes something that's going to take a while. So I couldn't manage to make it happen. So this is a map that shows the military tract outlines of each of the township. And initially, when they started the military tract, they gave each township a number. And the law that created the military tract, that actually defined that it was going to be surveyed in 1789, that law said that they would start at the falls of what at that time was referred to as Onondaga River, which is now a Oswego River. So for some reason they said that the surveys would begin, and that's probably why this is referred to as township number 1. They said that the surveys would begin at that point there, and that they would survey 60,000 acres for each township. And the names of the towns, initially some of the history books and some of the people said that the names were the result of the Surveyor General Simeon DeWitt. Well, the names of these Roman, Greek, classical names were not popular when they signed the names back in the 1700s and early 1800s. So Simeon DeWitt was quick to say, "Don't blame me, I didn't name them." The lots were named by Robert Harper. And Robert Harper, some resources refer to him as a clerk, but he was the secretary of the land commissioners that were responsible for dealing with the paperwork for the military tract lots. I composed a website with a summary of the military tract, and a descendant of Robert Harper contacted me because he didn't like that I was referring to his ancestor as a clerk. Robert Harper went on to become an assemblyman. He went on of New York State. He went on to become a deputy secretary of state, and Harper College in Binghamton is named after him. So even though at the time of the military tract he was a secretary of the land commissioners, he went on to become a very significant individual. This is the original 1790 map of the township of Prudence, and I've got a large print of that if you want to look at it more closely. We're lot 73, which is right there. If you notice on this map that in the right-hand corner, the lower right-hand corner, the southeast corner of the military tract lots, there is a yellow square. And what that represents is what they call the state's 100 acres. Remember how the Continental Congress gave each Revolutionary War soldier 100 acres in Ohio. Well, those soldiers who were balloted to receive this bounty land had a choice to make. Did they want to take the 100 acres in Ohio that the Continental Congress was offering, or did they want to take all of the 600 acres that they were being awarded in the Military Tract area that they were balloted? If they did not opt to forfeit the 100 acres that was given by Continental Congress, they had to, if they forfeited the 100 acres rather that were given by the Continental Congress, they would get the total 600 acres. If they opted to take the 100 acres that was offered in Ohio, then they would only get 500 acres in the Military Tract. And if that occurred, the 100 acres would be forfeited to New York State, and they would auction that off. And they would auction them off in 1794. The state would auction off all these state's 100 acres, rather. It's hard to see on this map, but there's also some small sort of pink areas on this map. Those were what was referred to as the Survey 50s. Each soldier that was balloted to receive one of these lots had to pay 48 shillings to cover the cost of having the lot surveyed, which at the time was cheap because it was 50 acres and bounty land, or land in this area was selling for more than 1 shilling per acre. So it would have made sense that they would have sold the land, but about 20% of them, I think, I'll look at the numbers later on, but there's quite a few that did not pay the 48 shillings. They forfeited the 50 acres. So they probably didn't have the money to pay the 48 shillings. But the issue was that the 48 shillings would not only go to pay the surveyors, but they would go to have roads built. And having roads built at the time was a big deal. And the state really wanted roads built. They wanted people to be able to get from one lot to the next. So they were really, and I'll talk about that, it'll come up in just a minute, that the state actually wanted roads to be built. And when they actually awarded the land as bounty land and land patents, they stipulated that 5 acres out of every 100 acres would be accepted and reserved for roads. And that meant preserving any existing roads. And if anybody was so inclined to build a new road, that they were to be reserved 5 acres. There wasn't any town governments there at the time that were going to build roads, but that's what they built that into the land patents. Holland's Island is referred to as Superior Island on this map. This map includes part of the town of Brutus, Mentz, a little bit of Montezuma, and some of Troop, and on the north end, you've even got some of the town of Conquest on this map. So this, you know how each one of the lots were supposed to be generally square and 600 acres? I took a transcript of the surveyor notes for the township of Scipio, and I actually put the chains and links on the map. A square 600 acres would be 77 chains and 47 or 48 links on all 4 sides. If you look at this map, they're all over the place. So if you've ever heard the term close enough for government work, this map shows that each one of the lots was slightly different. And when I was in the tax map office and we were trying to plot the military tract lines onto the tax maps for the first time, it was driving me crazy because I would measure a lot and I would say, this isn't 600 acres. And if you calculate the area in with these, they're not 600 acres. Some of them are close to 600. Some of them, I would say on average, are 620 to 640. There's a lot here, lot number 5. I love this because half of the lot is on the west side of Owasco Lake and the other half is on the east side. So if you were the lucky person who got lot number 5, you had a mile's worth of Owasco Lake separating you from one part of your land to the other. The good news was that the area of those two lots are actually exceed 700 acres. So they actually got a lot more land. And that's the other issue. If you get a lot along the shoreline that was not square, it was generally much larger. Not always, but it was sometimes much larger than 600 acres. If you remember, they had to survey the townships into 60,000 acres. So they probably wanted to make sure that they didn't run short. And also, they probably were inclined to, like a baker's dozen, they probably wanted to be on the high side rather than on the low side when they awarded the land to the Revolutionary War soldiers. I've got to hurry up. This is the balloting book. And if you look at lot 73, it was awarded to Oliver Harding, and 74 was awarded, or I'm sorry, 72 was awarded to Philip King. This is the balloting book, and this is a reprint of the book. When the land commissioners awarded the land, Robert Harper, who was the secretary of the land commissioners, would have handwritten into the balloting book the names of the soldiers that were, they took two boxes. They took a box where one historical record says there was a box and a barrel, but they took a box with 100 slips of paper numbered from 1 to 100, and they took another box with the Revolutionary War soldiers' names in it, and they would pull the names and they would match it up to what lot they were supposed to receive. When they got to 94 of the lots in the military tract, the last 6 were reserved for the development of gospel, church, schools, and literature. And if you look at the laws, they actually allocated only 2 lots, one for the development of literature and the other lot for the development of schools and gospel churches. The other 4 lots, because they reserved 6 lots and they only were required to use 2 for that purpose, the other 4 lots were for land that was underwater. If somebody was awarded a bounty land lot that was predominantly underwater, they could petition to what became the Onondaga Commissioners, a kind of a tribunal judge ship a group of people that would decide conflicts in the military tract. And the other people that sometimes got some of those extra 4 lots were officers they got larger quantities of land than the 600 acres, and sometimes the toll that they were allocated wasn't divisible by 600, so they would need to come up with an extra couple hundred acres. This is the map that I have a print of, and it was of the north. It's the northwest portion of the first sheet of DeWitt's state map of New York. So Simeon DeWitt drafted this map. This map is dated 1792 or 93. And the reason we know that is that Galen was surveyed in 1792, but the town of Sterling is not on this map. And Sterling was surveyed in 1794. So we know that this map was dated somewhere in between that. Now, the military tract took in the counties, all of the county of Virginia, all of the county of Seneca and Onondaga, and all of Portland, and it took in part of Schuyler County, Tompkins County, Wayne County, and Oswego County. So this is a land patent for the spot where we are right now. This is the land patent from the New York State Archives that grants the land for lot 73, which is where we are right now. And this is the very first document that establishes private ownership of this particular area. Before that, it was occupied by Native Americans pursuant to treaties. So this is a significant document to this particular area. And it says that Oliver Harding got lot 73 in the township approved as containing, and here again it says containing 600 acres, and that's what all the laws say. But if you look at the survey notes, I should have pointed out that the survey notes for this particular lot calculate to 637 acres, not 600. Now, there were restrictive covenants in these deeds. It said that 5 acres out of every 100 would be reserved for highways, but it didn't specify where they would be, who was going to build them. They just wanted a way to preserve any existing roads and kind of motivate people to build new roads, because they wanted some way for people to get from one lot to the other. And the other restrictive covenant was that you had to have one settlement on the land within 7 years, or the land would revert to New York State. So New York State wanted the land to be settled. And they left a space on here for situations where they would take the 100 acres in Ohio, and they had to put a clause in the deed saying that they would reserve that 100 acres. And that's what they have in this deed. It says that they reserve 100 acres of the lot laid out in a square in the southeast corner. And that was because Oliver Harding, instead of taking all of the 600 acres he was entitled to in New York State, he took 100 acres in Ohio. And if you have a subscription to Ancestry.com, and you look at the boundary land warrants for the federal land, you'll find an entry for Oliver Harding where he was allocated 100 acres in Ohio from Congress. That's why that exception is in the deed, in the land patent. And this is the land patent for Philip King, who did not take the 100 acres in Ohio. And this particular deed says that he got the full 600 acres. And in the area where they would say the 100 acres is accepted, there's nothing filled in there. Now, initially the game plan was that they were going to survey the lots, have them approved on July 3rd, 1790, advertise to the soldiers that they could come and claim their land for 6 weeks in the newspaper, and they wouldn't award the land until the following year, January 1st of 1791. But when they talked about doing that, the soldiers said, forget this, we've laid it long enough. And so this particular deed, or this particular land patent rather, is dated the 8th day of July, 1790. And so when it says when it says in this land patent that they had to have a settlement on the land within 7 years, depending on how you interpret it, the original intent was that 7 years would run to 1799. But because they issued the land patents earlier than that, and they didn't change the wording, technically, if you interpret the wording, it says 7 years from the date that the land patent was drawn, or from the following January. So it would be January of 1791, not 1792. So they would have to occupy the land by 1798. In reality, the state they pretty much forgot about that clause. They did not, to my knowledge. I looked at the deed indexes for like 1798 and 99 in the Cuyahoga County Clerk's Office. There aren't a whole slew of deeds from New York State conveying the lots all over again. So if there was probably very few, if any, situations where the New York State came out and said, you haven't settled this land, and it reverts back to us. So the land had to be settled by January 1st, 1798. This is a deed where Oliver Harding sells the 500 acres that he owns in this particular area to Elijah Buck. Now, I'm speculating here. I don't know if it's just a coincidence that they sold it in November of 1797, or whether they were looking at the deadline of January 1st, 1798. So that may have served to be a motivation for people to settle in the land before there was a risk of forfeiting the land back to the state. And this is a surveyed 50 acres. Remember how they had to pay 48 shillings to offset the cost of having the land surveyed? Well, this is lot 75, in this area, which is east of here. And if you look at the grantor, the seller in this deed, it's Simeon DeWitt, the Surveyor General. So if somebody didn't pay their 48 shillings, starting in 1794, the Surveyor General would sell those lots at auction. So these are the numbers. There were 2,800 lots. There were 28 townships, 100 lots in each township. There was 164 that ended up being reserved for gospel, churches, and literature. So that left 2636 that was left to be balloted. There was 2,090 soldiers in the balloting book that were eligible. 536, which is about 20% of the people, took their 100 acres in Ohio. 37% didn't come up with the 48 shillings to pay their survey fee, so they forfeited 50 acres to New York State. In the balloting book, they say in the back portion of the book whether the land patent was delivered to somebody else or whether it was delivered to a soldier. And only 9% of the soldiers actually took delivery of the land themselves. But I would venture to guess that even that is not a valid number for how many soldiers actually settled here. There's a YouTube video from the former Seneca County historian, and he was claiming that in Seneca County there was maybe 4 people that he could document of the soldiers that actually settled there. And if you took the time to look at the 9% from Cuban County, they probably, if you looked at the census records and tried to figure out if they actually settled here, I would imagine that you would find out that it's even much less than that. Now, I looked at the 100 people that were balloted to receive land in the township of Brutus, and in that situation, the balloting book says that 12% of them had died by the time the land was balloted. I don't know if that's a valid assumption that the same percentage would be valid for the rest of the military tract or not. But based on these numbers, about 91% of the lots were sold and assigned to somebody else, usually land speculators. And oftentimes, the officers in the Sullivan campaign and the officers in the 2 regiments that were eligible for this land, sometimes they were the biggest land speculators. They would have gone to the soldiers under their command and say, I'll give you so much for your, if you will sign over your claim to the bounding land. In the county clerk's office, I'm just put this in there for reference. In the county clerk's office before the middle 1800s, in addition to a grantee and grantor index to deeds, in addition to indexing the deeds by the buyer and seller, they also had an index that was by lot number. So this is lot 73, and in this index, they just, every time somebody came to the county clerk's office and filed a deed, they would write the book page number in the number of acres in the lot on this index. So it was the book with the acres over the page. It looks like a fraction. So if you're doing historical research and you want to know who the first settlers were in any of the military tract lots, this is a sequential list of all the deeds. And it's no longer in the county clerk's office. They don't even know what you're asking. If you go, I actually went there and asked recently if I could look at this. It's in the historian's office, and they also have a copy in the record retention office. This is a map that I took from tax maps showing the military tract lots in the towns of Mentz and Montezuma and the current roads. And I realize this is hard to read. I've got a print of it that I brought along. But you can see how big the lots are. This is a blow-up of lot 73. So you can see how big lot 73 was, how big lot 72 and so forth. So we're a very small part of what was lot 73. This is a map that I drew of lot 3 of the town of Brutus that I found when I was doing this presentation. This shows just lot number 3 in the township of Brutus, which is now Conquest. And you'll notice that the north, west, and east boundaries of this particular lot turned into roads. And they actually put a road through the middle of it, which, I mean, this was for the original land commissioners, this was a dream come true. This is what they wanted. So, in 1794, when they created Onondaga County, it was bizarre. They took the 28 townships and they combined them into 11. We're not sure why they did this. Maybe somebody here that's done some research can tell me, but they combined all of these 28 townships into 11 townships. But that wouldn't last very long. They would soon, this is a list for Cuba County, they would soon divide the townships back into smaller towns, and each one of those Roman classical Greek names that they got rid of in 1794, all of them made a comeback. They all were, so this is a chart just for Cuba County that shows that they all came back again. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to point out that in 1790, New York State only had 14 counties. By 1825, New York State had 56 counties. And today, and it goes back to 1914, they have 62 counties. So once Central New York was settled, they developed it like crazy, and they broke up those townships into smaller counties, smaller towns and villages. There's a map that I brought along that's from the Burr Atlas. It's on one of the easels there. In 1825, the state of New York, there was no Google Maps, there was no road atlases, and all of these counties were being divided up. And Cuba County went from 8 military tract townships. By 1825, there were 18. And this scenario was going on all over the state. And the state was having a very difficult time keeping track of the maps and knowing exactly where the boundaries of all these new towns were located. So in 1825, they hired one of the most prominent surveyors that worked for the Continental Congress, David Burr, who had drafted maps for the postal delivery districts for the federal government. He drafted railroad maps for the federal government. They hired him to take all of the records and draw an accurate set of county maps. And like I say, I brought along one. The maps were actually, when the atlas was done, it was dated 1829. And it looks it doesn't look like it's much to talk about today. It's very plain. But in 1829, that was a landmark map. And the governor of New York State did a very ingenious thing. He sent a copy of that 1829 Burr Atlas to all of the governors of the 50 states. So it turned out to be the template of how maps would be drawn in the future. And it was only the second time that a state atlas had been used, had been drawn like that. The first one was in South Carolina. Thank you so much for listening to that. Was debating whether I could do it.
Well, don't go anywhere yet. You may have some questions.
I know.
So thank you very much. That was very informative. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. Does anybody have questions? Yes. I can turn on the lights, but if you want to, why don't you stand up and shout loudly so people can hear you?
I've seen deeds where they didn't get the whole 600. So, did New York State on the surveys, they just do the corners of the 100 lots, and then they had whoever got the land had to hire a local surveyor to come in and tell them where they were going in the woods? Well, back at the time, the only way of surveying was generally to put a wooden stake in the ground or put some type of reference on a tree. So I don't know if they actually came back and surveyed the survey 100s. They were always in a square form in the southeast corner of the lot. So New York only did the township, the corners of the township, and not the 100 lots. They marked trees. If you read the surveyor notes, they marked trees with numbers on the trees, is my understanding. And if you read the survey notes, sometimes the tree wouldn't exactly be the corner of the lot. In the case of lot 73, they refer to there being a stake 12 lengths, which would be about 8 feet away from the tree. So I don't know if that answers you. I don't know if they actually did anything more than reference trees and stakes in the original records.
And those references to the trees and stakes were at the corners of each of the 100 or just the whole township?
No, in each of the 600-acre lots, yes.
So my question is, when my ancestors came, and they said, yeah, you get this lot, how the heck did they know where it was?
That's exactly right. That's when I said that if you got lot 73, and I found that the Portland Historical Society had a map that a land speculator had drawn, and they had probably taken that map from 1792 with all the townships, and they had actually put the names of the townships and actually categorized whether the land was good or poor. And I would imagine that when they awarded the lots, they would give the soldier their land patent, and they would probably either show them or all these maps, like the township maps that showed the boundaries of those lots, and they would know how many chains of links from one lot to the other. So they would probably tell I don't really know for sure. I would guess that they would would actually show this map to the soldiers, and they would, based on how many lots were separating them from the other lots, they would know approximately how many miles they would have to go from certain mouths of rivers and streams and so forth. It's a good question. How did they ever, like I said earlier, the person that got lot 73, I'm just imagining that they said, start at Owasco Lake and follow the outlet 7 or 8 miles and look for a tree that's got 73 marked on it. I mean, it's bizarre. I'm to this day absolutely amazed that the lines actually formed the townships and villages that we have today. And they pretty much worked out. I mean, when we drew the tax maps, there were situations where somebody had a farm that was in their family for generations, and they just sold off the land without surveying it and referred to the land as being 100 acres or 200 acres. And when we drew the tax maps and actually calculated that they had 110 acres instead of 100, people came in the office and said, "You're wrong. I shouldn't be taxed for another 10 acres. And we were not wrong. They really physically had 110 acres oftentimes. The other thing is there were a few situations where over the years people presumed that the military tract line was in a certain spot. That's where the hedgerows would be. That's where everything after that point would be surveyed. And if you took like one of the townships at the northerly end and you matched it up with the lots at the south end, it wouldn't necessarily today result in a straight line. It should, by theory, based on the survey maps, but you'll find that occasionally, just because 150 years ago, somebody decided this is where my boundary is, and they have something called adverse possession and so forth. It is what it is. That's what it turned out to be.
Sure. After the veterans got done with exercising their privileges from the deal, and as time passed, what happened to the acreage that nobody took?
Well, it was all balloted off. Actually, they did 25 townships initially, and they added 3 more because more people wanted land than they had allocated. So all of the land ended up being balloted off or auctioned off by the New York State government. There weren't any lots. If there were, then the state just auctioned them off.
I see.
Now, it's interesting to note that there was 100 acres in Ohio, and there were 600 acres in the military tract lots. So that's a total of 700 acres, but they were only entitled to 600. So either way, whether they didn't take the 100 acres in New York State and they forfeited the 100 acres, or whether they took the 100 acres in Ohio and the state got the either way, the state got 100 acres that they could sell at auction and get money for. So somebody at the state level who designed this whole plan was very ingenious, because they said, we don't have any money, let's design it in a way that we've got 100 acres that we can auction off eventually and get some money.
Just for fun, I'll mention that somewhere around 1990, my first cousin, once removed, decided to log their property down in Greene County. It took them a year to figure out where the lines were.
Yeah.
Because it had never been surveyed. And they just had to work with the county clerk and the real property office and the neighbors to agree, because it was hard to understand that 100 acres measured in 1798 wouldn't necessarily be 100 acres measured today.
Who was Peter Reichman?
Peter Reichman was a white man that was welcomed into the Cuban nation. He was a white settler who was actually adopted into the tribe. And when they, in 1795, when they subdivided the land in the Cuban reservation to allocate it off and moved the Native Americans there to a smaller reservation area, they specifically put in that treaty that they wanted, I think it was a square mile for Peter Reichman, because he was a white man that had been adopted into the tribe. There's also, Bill Heck knows, there's also an area that they reserved that they call the mine reservation. And to this day, nobody knows what the mine was. There was probably not salt mines there. It would have been limestone or gypsum, I don't know. We're not sure what the mine reservation really was in the Cuba reservation. Unless,
So in regards to the map you have in your hand,
Yep.
when they were drawing that and putting in the state's hundreds, was it just blank and then as the state took?
to my understanding, I don't know how else it would work. They'd have to know that when the soldier came in to redeem their land, and they were pulled the name out of the box, they would have to probably make a decision. Were they going to take the land in Ohio, or were they going to forfeit that? So at that time, they would make that. So you're right, they would, after the surveys were done, not a long time after, but probably shortly after that, when they started, because this map, or a preliminary version of this map, was accepted by the land commissioners on July 3rd. And if you saw from the land patents, it was July 8th and 9th that they were dated. So, and at that time, they probably would have had to have told the land commissioners, were they going to forfeit their 100 acres, or were they going to take the 100 acres in Ohio?
So they were drawing it
As it was progressing, yeah, that would be. And there are multiple versions. There's a version of this map in the Secretary of State's office, and there's also a version that was in the Surveyor General's or State Engineer's office. And one of them has these state's 100 acres and Survey 50s marked on it. The other one doesn't. So if you go to the state archives and you look at their records, you'll find that there's varying, and some of them are on the internet, but most of them are most of the ones on the internet are the ones that show the Survey 50s and the state's 100 acres. For those of you that are researchers, there's something called Mix's Catalog. And in 1859, the state had survey maps and surveyor notes that were in multiple state departments. They were in the Secretary of State's office, the Surveyor General's office, State Comptroller's office, State Library. So they actually hired somebody to go through and do an inventory. And it was the guy's name was David Mix. And he did an inventory of all the state maps and all those agencies. And to this day, Mix's Catalog is still used by the New York State Archives as a way to know where the maps are in their collection. I have a reprint copy of it, if anybody, there are no more reprint copies available to my knowledge. The Central New York Land Surveyors Association printed up a very limited number, and they were either scarfed up by historians or land surveyors very, very quickly. There is an earlier version on the internet, like an 1851 version, but it's not as complete.
Did other states have this same?
Yeah, I should
system?
have mentioned that during the presentation. When New York State allocated the additional land in the 1780s, at that time, there were 5 other states that were pretty much simultaneously offering additional bounty land.
And then, did you ever figure out in the case with lot 73 went from Oliver Harding and then sold to Buck? But when I was doing some research, I found other people in the mix.
Yeah, I never found out. There were land speculators and a lot of fraud going on. There was a Onondaga commission that was actually formed to handle boundary complaints and ownership disputes. And there were something like 1,700 cases that went before that commission. And a lot of them were people that came forward and said, Oliver Harding signed this and said he was going to assign the claim to me, and it was fraud. They did not do that. Or maybe he didn't sign the right papers. I know what you're talking about. There was actually a deed where somebody else other than Oliver Harding claimed that they had, but it was just like one random deed where they claimed to sell lot 73, and then Oliver Harding came forward and sold it to Elijah Buck.
How much of this is online, or where do you find the records if we wanted to go looking? Where's the best place to start?
I contacted the New York State Archives, and if you just, I asked for the survey notes for lot 73 in Brutus. They sent me lot 73 in Ulysses. I told them it was wrong, and they a couple days later they sent me, and they did it for free. And they sent me the field notes, and they sent me the 2 land patents for free. And it only took a couple days. However, when I asked for an invoice for how much they would charge to send me the 25 cents a page, all of the survey notes for Brutus, they said that requires somebody to examine the records, decide how much time it would take, and there might be an additional per hour fee involved and so forth. So I wasn't able to make that happen. I wanted to get all the survey notes from the Township of Brutus for this presentation, but I couldn't get them to respond quick enough.
Have you seen, I've seen as late as 1825, there would be descendants that would, the state would actually pass with a particular soldier's name, bill for the relief of that particular soldier and give land to the descendants posthumously of the soldier. In 1825, they were still giving out land.
It's possible. I don't think it went that late, though. I don't think it would have gone that late.
Yeah.
I had a right relative in the Revolutionary War, and he was granted 160 acres of public land. Is this the same thing?
It might have been, but it sounds if it was less than 500 or 600 acres, it may have been a scenario where they were granted in a different area or from the federal land. It was small. But they did in the initial laws, when they first decided that they were going to give bounty land, they decided that there would be 150 lots in the township. At one time they were going to be smaller. At one time they were going to be a square mile. So it varied over the years, but they finally decided that they would be 600-acre lots, which really weren't 600 acres. They were usually a little bit more. I brought along some examples of actually this is the township of Aurelius, which has Auburn in it. This is the township of Brutus. I brought a few other maps along if you're interested in looking at them. And I didn't bring enough for anybody. If somebody was really, really wants to study it further, I did print out about 20 copies of today's, just the slides in the presentation.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.